Today we're moving on to a new section of the Hebrew Bible, the last of them. And so there was reading for today. I will not be trying to ascertain by anything we do today whether or how much of it was done, since we're first class meeting after break. I'm hopeful but realistic when it comes to these matters. Let's put it that way. But we are going to talk about or get started on the writings. We will probably get started talking about one of the more famous parts of the writings. In fact, there's at least one reference in the New Testament where it talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, right? The Psalms standing in for the whole of the writings. But before that, I want us to talk about the books from which, at the very least theoretically, there was reading assigned for today, from Ezra and Nehemiah. And the stories that are found in Ezra and Nehemiah actually go back a little before, right, a generation before, or at least some years before the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, right, connected with some prophets that you heard about, Haggai, Zechariah. And then fast forwards to the subject of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And so really what we're dealing with in this period is what we might call the Post-Exilic Period. And we've talked almost from the outset, even though we were talking about stories of creation, stories of other things, about the Babylonian exile, because that's a definitive experience in the life of the Jewish people. And it has an incredible impact on the biblical texts, not just their content, but also their composition, their editing, their collection, their publication, as we might call it, even though publication in the ancient world was not exactly the same as things we might think of as publication today. But even so, we can talk about publication of texts that are familiar to us from Scripture. And so, really what I want us to focus on is not so much details of the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, as what the impact was of the Babylonian exile. Right? And I think one of the most helpful ways of doing that is to go through some things that were different. Before we do that, let me just run through a couple of questions with you. Or maybe one question with lots of possible answers. Thus far, we've talked about Israel, and then Israel and Judah. We haven't really spoken about Judaism, right? And so one of the things that happens in the post-exilic period is we start to talk about the religion connected with these texts in terms of an ism, and that in itself is distinctive. But if we ask why, probably would be helpful to think about, what do you think of when you think of Judaism? What institutions, what characteristics, what features? And in particular, I'd be interested to know what things do you associate in your mind with Judaism, the Jewish religion, that we haven't really encountered much, if at all, this semester? Anyone want to have a go at answering that? What are some things that you think of when you think of Judaism? I mean, religious institutions, structures, emphases, practices, other things that really we haven't mentioned this semester. But if you think about Judaism as you know it today, to the extent that any of you know it today, what have we not really talked about? Anything come to mind? Yeah?
I guess like bar mitzvahs.
Okay, bar mitzvahs, yeah. There are a range of practices, right, that are... and bat mitzvahs. Sorry, make sure we're gender inclusive. Anyway, there are certainly a lot of practices that we've already encountered. We've had at least some mention of some practices like circumcision. We've had some celebrations and holidays, at least there in the scriptures. There's certainly going to be development of customs, practices beyond those that are strictly mandated in Scripture. And so certainly that is part of it. What else? Even more basic than that, where would you probably go if you were attending one of these? Yeah, James? Okay, temple. And by that, do you mean the temple in Jerusalem? No. What's another name for the thing referred to as a temple? And yeah.
Synagogue?
Yeah, synagogue. Right? And in fact, one thing that distinguishes different strands of Judaism in our time is whether people will refer to the synagogue as a temple. Because the temple in Jerusalem was a place where sacrifice was offered. Right? It's no longer there today. Most Jews would regard what happens in the synagogue as essentially, and effectively substituting for, taking the place of what happened in the temple. Some Jews would not be comfortable referring to a synagogue as a temple, precisely because, there's still a distinction to be made. What does synagogue mean? Anybody know? Yeah, we're the people who've done a little bit of smattering of Greek, right? Actually, if you start trying to break it down into roots, you might think it has something to do with synagogo, and that might not be where we want to go with this conversation. Okay, synagogue, right, comes from basically a gathering together, and actually means pretty much exactly the same thing in terms of what its roots, when put together, indicate, as the Greek word ecclesia, right? They're both from Greek, from which we get the word church, right? And so both of those become technical terms for gatherings of particular religious traditions. But in their essence, they mean a congregation, a gathering of people. Have we encountered synagogues in the texts we've been reading this semester? Or, for that matter, in our discussions? Hasn't really come up. And the reason for that is that this institution, right, and the fact that it has a Greek name might itself indicate something about when this institution really comes into its own. Probably goes back before the Hellenistic era, right, the Greek-speaking era, but not much, right? It seems to be a post-exilic institution. And the reason why this institution arises, why it's developed, why it becomes a focal point, has a lot to do with the post-exilic period, right? Let me move on to the next slide, right? What's different, right? We have the synagogue, and the main, it should have probably put it at the top of the list, but it's always hard trying to prepare a PowerPoint guessing what you're going to come up with and in what order. The synagogue develops as a place for gathering and for doing certain things precisely as a result of the exile, right? One of the things that results from the exile is that you now have what's known as the diaspora, right? Which again comes from a Greek word. Basically means the sort of the scattering, the dispersal. Right? From this period on, more than ever before, there are Jews, right, people whose homeland, ethnicity, religious tradition somehow connects them with Judah, right, that region, and that people, and that territory, but who are located in other parts of the world. Right? And so we have the development of institutions to meet the religious needs of Jews living in a wide array of places. Not yet in places like Indianapolis and Brooklyn and others, but in Babylonia, in Egypt, right, in Persia, in other parts of the world. And as they intersect more and move around more, the diaspora grows. And so from this period onward, we're dealing less with a religion that is strictly connected with the land of Judah, although to a large extent, at least in this period, we're still going to have some important ties. Right? It's in connection with the development of the synagogue that we also see something of a shift of focus, and that's one of the reasons why this terminology of should it be referred to as a temple, should it be referred to as a synagogue, is important. What happens in a synagogue, apart from, but also overlapping with, right? If you've ever been to a bar mitzvah, you may actually get a pretty good sense of what happens typically in a synagogue, even though it's tailored for that particular occasion. If anyone here ever been to a synagogue, what kinds of things happen there? Even if you haven't been, maybe you have a vague sense of what kinds of things people do at synagogue. Yeah. Okay. Okay. What might the in our context usually rabbi, right, speak about? Yeah. Yeah, right. And in fact, you'll have the development of a cycle of readings, right? A lectionary readings, right, that gets you through the whole of the Torah, and also, as a second reading, the prophets over the course of a certain set period of time. So there's reading from Scripture, right? And the fact that there's such a thing as Scripture, of course, is something that becomes characteristic of this period. In the Pentateuch, right, there are references to Moses writing, and of course some of you in your papers were exploring that, right? And the fact that on the one hand there are references to Moses writing, on the other hand, those references are presumably written by someone else saying Moses wrote, and so the whole issue of authorship and things like that. We're moving through the text and through the history of this people. There will be references to the law, its rediscovery in the time of Josiah, things like that. But on the whole, right, while there is some focus on law, there isn't really much in the way of focus on Scripture in the sense that people gather regularly to hear it read, right? That there's some institution that facilitates that. And it's in this period that, and we can't date it very precisely, but certainly when we get to the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the things that we're told is that they read from the law, the book of the law, which now starts to sound like something like the Pentateuch. And it's something that takes a long time, right? It's not something that you do in a period of hours. It might be part of one of the books that now makes up the law. We also have discussion of it being explained, and that may reflect, among other things, some linguistic changes in this period. But the very fact that we have collections of writings that start to be regarded as Scripture, as well as the gathering and editing of others, and an ongoing process of writing in this period, because obviously at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah are not written yet, and yet they will eventually become part of the Jewish collection of Scripture. So the process of writing Scripture is ongoing, but the focus on Scripture itself is something that really is, in a very real sense, new to this era, right? And so that description that will be used in later times to refer to Jews and Christians by Muslims, for example, people of the book, becomes a characteristic of the Jewish religion in this period. In addition to reading Scripture and possibly sermons and things like that, commenting on Scripture, what else do you think might happen in synagogue? Now, give you a hint if you have absolutely no idea. Try substituting church for synagogue, and what you'll find is that you come up with a lot of the right answers. What other kinds of things? Oh, look at all the hands. Great. Singing. Yeah, singing. And in fact, when we ask what are they singing, we're going to look at the Psalms, which certainly some of them clearly go back to the Pre-Exilic period. Some of them reflect the experience of exile. And so at the very least, the final version of that collection comes from this period. Singing. Yeah. What else? Praying, yeah, prayer. In fact, one of the terms, right, that you get in Hebrew and Aramaic, right, before you get synagogue as a Greek term, is house of prayer, right? But synagogue indicates something that the term for church also indicates. In our time, if you're thinking about a church or a synagogue, you think of a building, right, and only on a sort of secondary level, people who gather in that building, right? The terminology actually indicates that the development of the institution takes the reverse form, right? First you have gatherings of people, and when these gatherings become large enough, when there's a large enough Jewish community in some place like Rome or Babylon or any other cities around the world, then you have perhaps the setting aside of a particular building for the meetings of that community, for other communal activities and things like that. Yeah. No. Yeah, communion, right, which is focused on, sort of the Last Supper, obviously. But, of course, the Last Supper arguably was a Passover meal, right? And so there's a connection with the Jewish institution there. But, no, yeah, one thing that would be a difference between churches and synagogues would be the practice of communion. Although not the practice of eating, right? That certainly unites both traditions. So there are occasions when people would gather together and do that. And the distinction may have been less noticeable in the time of the early church, for instance, because we do get the impression that the celebration of communion or the Lord's Supper or whatever we want to call it in fact, was part of a communal meal that they had together, right? And so the distinction may have been less striking. But yeah, that's a difference rather than a similarity when we get down to it. Anything else?
Maybe tithing or
Yeah, giving. And one of the things that connected the diaspora with the temple in Jerusalem, right, when it's rebuilt and which was under the Roman era, is that people in the diaspora, Jewish people living in other parts of the world, would contribute to, right, tithes and things that were understood to be required by law, but also would give for the purpose of maintaining sacrifices there. So even though they couldn't be present, the distances were simply too far for them to be present regularly, would feel a part of that by contributing to the activities of the temple in Jerusalem. Yeah. Anything else? Why is it that when we substituted church for synagogue, we were able to come up with a list of what kind of things happen in the synagogue? Probably a good question to ask. It may be just that in a lot of religious traditions, you get a lot of the same things happening, right? If you were to get beyond Judaism and Christianity, you'd still find singing going on, you'd still find praying going on. Yes?
Well, I mean, we have a lot of beliefs, but they don't believe that Christ was the Son of God, correct? So, I mean, they would have a lot of similarities other than that.
Yeah, and certainly the idea that, Jesus was the Messiah is a key point of difference between Jews and Christians, right? Obviously. The idea that there is such a thing as a Messiah to be expected, be a point of similarity. And of course, once we get down to the modern era, right, there have been a lot of subsequent changes in Judaism that we need to talk about. But one of the things we need to mention is that when we're talking about the early church, as we will be very soon, in its origins, this is a Jewish movement. Right? It's a Jewish messianic movement, which is persuaded that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And initially, at least, these were people who believed Jesus was the Messiah, but who, in most cases, were connected with some local Jewish community and went to synagogue. And even when you get conflicts and you get divergence between these two traditions, a lot of the heritage of what one does when one gathers together for worship is going to, be taken over and resemble that. And you'll still have the use of some of the same, you have the same scriptures. Right? There will eventually be additional scriptures added to them, Christian scriptures, but you have those scriptures there as the sort of the first segment of the Christian canon as it develops, and some of the same songs and some of the same other things. And so historically there is a connection, and that's one of the reasons why you can figure out what goes on in the synagogue by extrapolating to some extent from experience of churches. Obviously there are differences. And the institution as a whole reflects this period of wider geographic spread, which starts a process of decentralization and is going to begin the process of shifting the religion's focus away from things like sacrificial worship, not because they will cease to be connected with the temple altogether, but because the geographical distance is so far. And in this period, it becomes clear that the outlook of Deuteronomy, right, the requirement of centralization of worship, does catch on. Right? It is accepted by the majority of Jews as a requirement, and so they're not sacrificing in synagogues. They're not participating in sacrifice in most places, and that's at least true of most of them. There are exceptions that we could talk about. But for the most part, that becomes typical of Judaism, which means that what religion means for people on a day-to-day basis increasingly has less of a focus on sacrificial worship and more on reading of Scripture and singing and prayer. And we talked about one of the reasons why religions that are focused on prophecy and individuals who can speak for God and that sort of thing often develop into religions of the book. We saw that immediately prior to the exile, right, there was conflict between prophets, right, and confusion about who to listen to. And so having some kind of text that one can, somebody claims to be a spokesperson for God, you say, ha ha ha, not so fast. And you start flipping the pages. Of course, we're still dealing with scrolls here, and so flipping pages is not part of it yet. But having some kind of text that you can appeal to, right, to navigate competing claims to speak for God, is something that often develops precisely because otherwise, right, there's potential for a lot of confusion and other things. Okay, let's see. So we've mentioned focus on the book, synagogue, diaspora. On a previous occasion, actually mentioned this, at least briefly. It's during this period that we're going to have a shift to Aramaic being a widely spoken language among Jews. Aramaic, historically, is the language of the Babylonians. And one change that clearly dates to this period is that we start to have Hebrew written with the Aramaic alphabet. And so if you think of Hebrew at all, if you picture it, with those sort of squarish letters, that is the historic alphabet used for Aramaic, right, which only secondarily becomes the Hebrew alphabet. Hebrew is more famous nowadays than Aramaic, and so you probably think of it as the Hebrew alphabet. But there is a change in alphabet in this period. Messiahs and messianic expectations. We already had a mention of that. And certainly that is going to be something important in this period, right? And in Haggai and Zechariah, right, we get a hint that in connection with the rebuilding of the temple, right, there was an individual who seems to have been connected with the line of David, Zerubbabel, who was also in a leadership position over the Judean community. And there seemed to have been expectations that perhaps God would restore the throne to the line of David in his time. Does not happen. During this period, right, there's going to be disruption to, in fact, two anointed figures, right? Not just the king, right, who was anointed, but also the high priest. Eventually, there's going to be some disruption to the line of high priests. And so by the time we get down to the centuries closest to the time of the rise of Christianity, there's going to be expectation of at least one Messiah, right? Oftentimes people were much more concerned with a king who would, reduce taxes and do things of that sort of practical sort, more so than concerned with the right person being in the priesthood. But there's going to be expectation that God would restore the rightful person to these lines, or in some cases restore these lines altogether. And so the rise of messianic expectations is something that is characteristic of this period as well. We also have a lot of interaction with other cultures and religions and ideas, and that's not necessarily something that's distinctive of the period we're dealing with. It's presumably something that was true throughout the history of this people, since they were a smaller people, intersecting and often ruled over by other people with different cultural and religious traditions. But increasingly, as you have Jews living amongst these other people as well, right, and not simply being ruled over by foreigners, and you pay your tribute, and maybe there's only a minimal amount of direct interaction. As increasingly Jews are living amongst these people, there's increased interaction. And so on the one hand, we're going to find the influence of, or at the very least, dialogue with other religious ideas in this period. And whether it's with ideas from the Persian tradition, ideas from Greek tradition, once we get down to the Hellenistic era, we're going to see interaction with Zoroastrian ideas of dualism and the afterlife, Greek philosophy, once we get to that period. Conversely, we're going to have an increasing focus on certain Jewish practices as setting them apart from other people. Right? How many of you eat snails regularly? Interesting. There you go. We've got a fan, but I think still not regularly. If we were to put you in the context, send you off to France, right, for study abroad, or bring somebody from France here, right, the eating or non-eating of snails, rather than being just something that you do or don't do, and everyone around you is doing the same thing, might become something that is noticeable as a distinctive of your identity, right? And to a large extent, we're going to have the same thing happening in connection with Judaism, right? The fact that certain foods are eaten and others are not, right? The fact that one day is set aside for rest and increasingly for gathering and worship, right, in the diaspora as well. These distinctive practices are going to become more focal precisely by virtue of the fact that they are things that set Jews living in the diaspora apart from their neighbors, right? And so increasingly, some of the things that we're talking about will take on a different significance in Judaism, right? They're not simply what the people of Judah do, as opposed to the people who live in Rome, but they're what Jews do even when they're living in Rome, in distinction from their Roman neighbors, right? And so the dynamics of being a minority religious group in a number of different settings is also going to change the significance that some of these activities have for Jews. Okay, well, there we've got some of the institutions, some of the characteristics which either develop during the period after the Babylonian exile or take on a new significance during this period.